Hello and welcome to this week's Intelligence Squared podcast with me, Farah Jassat.
And me, Daniel Ben-Corin.
This week we had the BBC journalist Razia Iqbal speak to the investigative reporter Ian Urbina about crimes on the high seas, everything from pirates to trafficking and illegal fishing. Daniel, tell us about it.
Yes, so Ian Urbina is one of the world's best respected investigative reporters, and he has a new book out called The Outlaw Ocean. He spent about 5 years researching this book. 3 of them were spent at sea, and he looked at the criminal underworld that exists in international waters. So everything from traffickers and smugglers to pirates and mercenaries to illegal fishermen, repo men, and vigilante conservationists. An entire underground society that exists in international waters where there are no laws.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It helps us to know what you think and others to find the episode. We'd really appreciate it if you've got a spare 30 seconds. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, I'm Razia Iqbal, journalist for the BBC. Welcome to this week's Intelligence Squared podcast. Now, you can sign up for regular updates about podcasts and other events at intelligencesquared.com. Ian, it's a real pleasure to speak to you today. Let's start by outlining a little bit what this book is about. The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. What do you mean by that?
I mean, this is an exploration of a frontier that happens to cover 2/3 of the planet, and that, in my view, is largely defined or best understood as a realm of extra-legal activity, quite diverse extra-legal activity, not all bad, some good, but most of it beyond the reach of government oversight.
And let's talk a little bit first then about why you wanted to do this book, because the basis of it is several investigations that you conducted for the New York Times, but the book itself has taken you years to write.
Yeah, I'm a slow writer, but it was a large undertaking. I think the motivation was, on the simplest and most initial level, just to take the opportunity to go out into this space and bring readers there, partially because it's so sprawling, partially because I'd worked there before and I knew a lot of interesting things were happening out there, but partially also just because it's sort of beyond the horizon. It's a space that I think most of us landlubbers rely on. 90% of everything we consume comes by way of ship, and 50% of the oxygen we breathe comes from the oceans. And for lots of other reasons, it's a really vital space. 50 million people work out there, and yet we rarely hear stories about what's going on out there, and I thought that would be a service.
I want to go back to just one thing that you said in that last answer, that you worked there because you were doing a PhD and you abandoned it to go and work as what and where? Tell us.
So I was working on a dissertation in cultural anthropology and suffering long, cold Chicago winters and sort of losing steam on my dissertation. And I decided to run away from it for a while and go work as a deckhand on a research ship that was anchored in Singapore. And I was supposed to be kind of the resident anthropologist as the ship went around to various exotic places. But the ship got stuck in port for paperwork reasons for 3 months. And I ended up sort of being exposed to this diaspora, transient tribe of people, of workers, namely seafarers and fishers, who were fascinating to me, and had their own, hierarchy and language and code of conduct and lifestyle. And so I sort of ran away from one anthropological topic and backed my way right into another.
When you talk about this being a place that is lawless, the last untamed frontier, when did you first get a sense that these stories that were happening, these things that were happening to people on ships that you were observing were completely illegal? When was the first moment that you thought, I have a story here?
I kind of had the hunch before I launched on the series in the New York Times. Again, having been exposed to these workers and hearing their stories about what life is like out there, both on the ship itself and the extent to which the ship is almost a floating country where the captain is God, and the whole hierarchy and what that means just in terms of violence and discipline, and all the way to once you get on the high seas, international waters, the things that the dumping of arms, the dumping of oil, the trading of human beings, all these unbelievable things that we thought had been stamped out a century ago, these stories seem to indicate they were still going on out there. So when I set out to do the series, I wanted to, A, report it from the space and not report it on land as told by returning seafarers, and B, inform the public of the diversity of extra-legal behavior that's happening out there. So I sort of selected stories that attempted to establish the corners of the canvas, if you will.
So in as much as you wanted to be on these ships, and you were, this is a deeply researched book, give us some sense of the kinds of stories that you encountered. You've alluded to them, the illegal dumping of things, real violence, illicit fishing, and so on. Let's start with a story that you start with in the book. Outline for us the kinds of conditions that you saw people living in, because that really is the beginning of the reader learning how brutal the sea can be.
The conditions on the ships are potentially the most striking element out there. And even to this day, 7 years in, I'm still shocked anew each time I go out at what I see. The story that I think most captured that reality was a story about sea slavery, which is a loaded term, but essentially refers to the problem of often trafficked migrant, sometimes debt-bonded workers who end up sometimes very much against their will, even shanghaied, on fishing vessels and sort of spirited off to sea sometimes for years. And we had wanted to tell that story, and we wanted to figure out where to go to do so. We chose the South China Sea and the Thai fleet because it was a pervasive problem there. And we wanted to go into those waters and into that fleet and look at a specific type of vessel within that realm, which are these transshipment vessels, which are boats that stay out really, really far from shore, sometimes for years, and just keep fishing. And a mothership comes out and brings fuel and men and food and ice, and then they bring the fish back. And we had heard that the subset of ships that are transshipment vessels are the ones where you'll find the most acute atrocities of this sort. And so the challenge is getting out there, because they're often 250, 300 miles away. Sometimes these are Thai vessels fishing off the coast of Somalia, really far away. Long story short, we eventually got on several of these, and the one that we really profiled was sort of a textbook model. It was a Thai fishing vessel. It had 4 Thai officers and 40 Cambodian crew. All those crew were trafficked men, and many of them boys, some as young as 13, 14 years old. And just sort of aside from the basics of working 6-7 days a week, 20 hours a day, rain or shine, on an incredibly dangerous work floor, the ship, is rat infested, roach infested, no sort of medical supplies. You get sick, you're probably going to have to figure that out on your own. And then just really acute violence from the officers on the crew if they make minor mistakes.
So what sorts of things would incur the wrath of anyone who's in an official capacity?
Minor infractions like moving too slow, being sick, getting seasick, putting a mackerel in a bucket that's meant for sablefish, dropping a valuable fish in a way, that might bruise it, seeming to cop an attitude with an officer. All these sorts of things could result in beatings or worse. That in 2000, the UN did a survey of this very demographic. So Cambodian deckhands who had returned to shore, and nearly 50% of them had witnessed firsthand murder on board, either of deckhands on deckhands, or more often officers on crew.
And no one is ever held accountable for any of this?
Very rarely, extremely rarely, for lots of reasons. One, the demographics of the victims. These are doubly invisible people, right? So they're migrants to begin with. So they're usually Cambodian or Laotian or Rohingya or Burmese, and they are on a Thai vessel. they don't have papers to be in the country. And then secondly, they're out beyond the horizon where there are no police anyway, and they're staying out there sometimes for years on end. So, the law that exists is what the captain says. That's the law.
And the fishing itself is also illicit.
Yeah, this is an interesting intersection of sort of human rights and labor crimes and environmental crimes. A lot of what's happening on these sorts of vessels is illegal fishing. And the reason you can say that, or at least the causal connection between the two types of crime, are somewhat explained by the story of overfishing near shore stocks. So, industrial boats have essentially raked clean what fish are near and catchable. And so these ships have to go ungodly distances from shore to catch a bare minimum just to break even. And this was already a thin margin type of industry to begin with, and now it just got even worse. Fuel is very expensive, and so captains try to find ways to cut costs, and that often means using captive workers, and then sometimes not even paying them afterwards.
And the way in which these young boys and men are captured, or at least persuaded to be the fishermen and the deckhands, is also a dimension that you look at. The way in which young girls are trafficked in order to lure the men onto the boats.
Yeah, there's a really dark intersection between two pipelines of trafficked labor in the case of Thailand, but elsewhere too. In Thailand's case, we went to a border town to look at this specifically, a town called Ranong. And what you see there is boys and men from Cambodia, for example, are coming across the border, hidden in the back of trucks, etc. Oftentimes there's males and females coming across the border initially. Soon after the border, there are places where they're separated. And the narrative that has attracted these workers is typically for the men, I can find you a good job in construction in Thailand. And it's a good paying job, and you can send the money home, come with me. And for females, it's usually, I can find you a good job as a domestic, so a live-in nanny, maid, come with me. Well, truth is, neither of those jobs are actually on offer. The men are actually being routed to the docks, and the women are being routed to the sex work industry. And at the border, or shortly inside country at the border, you see the genders split. And the females are sort of routed to these karaoke bars, I put in air quotes, which are really brothels. And what's really dark is that then there's this clever and sinister tactic that's used where the deckhands, who are often coming from the very same villages as the sex workers, are then held in rooms at these karaoke bars as they're waiting for their ship to be ready to deploy. And these are small, sometimes unsavvy village folk who are not worldly wise, not to mention the fact that they don't speak Thai, and so they have no idea what's going on, and they don't have a scent of their name. And so now they're housed at a place. They begin carousing with the females. They run up a tab at the bar thinking that, well, it's not on them. And lo and behold, that debt that they've accrued is used to sell them for a higher price to the boat captains and essentially enslave them for even longer. So you have a situation where trafficked girls are being used to further entrap trafficked boys.
It's also deeply, deeply grim. I want to go back a little bit and ask you about access, because you talked about how far away from anywhere a lot of this takes place. So international waters occur 12, 13 miles away from any land. How did you persuade people to let you get onto these vessels?
So the book varies, right? So it's about murder of stowaways and arms trafficking and dumping of oil and a whole variety of crimes. And the answer to that question varies per topic. In the case of sea slavery, which was one of the more difficult ones to report, partially because we were trying to get so far out, the approach we used was, initially we thought, well, why don't we, being this amazing photographer, British photographer named Adam Dean, and I thought, well, ideally we could find a captain willing to take us out the full distance. So we went to a port town in Thailand called Songkhla and sort of set up camp there somewhat discreetly because Thailand was getting a lot of attention already. And we just started taking captains out and trying to convince them to serve as a taxi for us. It was not an easy sell. We quickly realized that there was no way we were going to get any of them to take us out the full distance. So we were going to have to find someone who's willing to take us out a shorter distance, like 50 miles, and then talk our way onto another ship. That took a while too, and eventually when we found those who would do that first jump, the first jump in the hopscotch routine was always the first one. It was always the most difficult one. And they would say, look, fine, I'll take you out, but you have to meet me 7 miles out and get on my ship there. And then I'll take you 50 out, put you on another ship, and you're on your own from there, because they didn't want to be seen in port with us climbing on their ship.
And a lot of this, I mentioned how deeply researched this is. This requires enormous resources and commitment from the part of both your employer at the New York Times, but also your publisher. I mean, it does feel as though this has been a huge commitment on the part of lots of people.
That's quite right. Yeah, no, it's a very expensive line of reporting. And as you well know, our business of journalism is not a lucrative one and not doing so great financially these days. So it's a tough sell. The Times was amazing in taking this leap of faith for 2 years, and the series ran in the paper for a year and a half, 2 years. And then, my publisher in the US and UK, allowed me to take 2 years leave from the paper and go back out to sea to report, 80% more,
And what are your sea legs like?
Interestingly, I have a strange inner ear that allows me to not get seasick, which is a real luxury, but I get horribly landsick. So the longer I stay out there, the worse I am when I get back. And I have essentially standing bed spins, and I throw up because I can't get my pendulum to switch back. And so I feel like I'm rocking even though I'm on land. And that's the harder adjustment.
Wow.
But I'm in good shape on the vessels.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, the big revelation in this book is that there is clearly a system at work here that is designed to prevent accountability of any number of the things that you have already outlined. Was that the thing that shocked you and propelled you to continue to investigate?
Two things. Yeah, the incredible lack of enforcement. It was such a simple, almost cliche truth. Laws are only as good as their enforcement. And to see it in such a stark reality out there where there was literally no police. And so these terms on the books didn't matter. That was a shocker and kind of kept me wanting to prove that point over and over again. And then the second, I think, thing that struck me was how robust a world this frontier is in terms of the colorful characters and wild-eyed activities that are going on out there. Again, not always bad. Some of them just sort of vigilante conservationists and abortion providers who are trying to ferret women offshore in places where getting an abortion is illegal and dangerous. People, repo men who are stealing ships on behalf of New York bankers. I mean, there's just a wild west sort of environment out there that made me think, this is a story that will keep on giving.
Let's focus a little on one of the ones that you've mentioned, because the world that you paint, the picture that emerges is almost entirely male. You mentioned the young girls who are trafficked, but you talked about the abortion ship. This is a Dutch doctor and an artist, Rebecca Gompertz, who travel around the world. Just tell us that story of providing abortions for women who come from countries where it's illegal.
Right. So my interest in Rebecca was twofold. One, I very much wanted to find and engage with characters who are female because the seafaring world is unbelievably male. And number two, I wanted to demonstrate the diversity of extra-legal behavior out there. Even some of it many people might agree with, but it's clearly on the edges of the law. Rebecca Gompertz is a really perfect example. As you said, she's a former Greenpeace doctor, OBGYN, Dutch, and she has a ship and an organization called Women on Waves. And her mission is to go to countries where abortion is both illegal and often dangerous for the women or girls who are seeking them. She typically will bring her ship or yacht, depending on what vessel she's using at the time, quietly into port. She'll plug into a sort of, I guess you would call it an underground network of advocates and doctors to find out where the most dire need was and to get in touch with those females and then find a way to get them to the port, to get them onto her ship. Gompertz does not perform surgical abortions. She performs medical abortions, so administers RU-486. But the loophole she plays on is one in which the law on a vessel is dictated by the flag the vessel flies. So, and that is true once you leave national waters. So the minute Rebecca would get her ship and those patients or clients out to the 13-mile mark, she was in international waters, and suddenly the law that applied there was the flag of her ship, in this case Austrian, and that meant that abortion providing was legal. And so this was sort of an interesting gaming of the system, and one that I thought sort of illustrated this odd frontier sort of element of the high seas.
Now it's time for a quick break.
Candy Crush is back and sweeter than ever, with thousands of new levels to complete and new characters to help you along the way. You can even play offline on your commute. Sounds sweet? Download Candy Crush Friends Saga now from the Google Play or Apple App Store.
In Urbina, let's look a little bit more closely at the way in which you've structured this book, because your ability to draw the reader in and present these stories almost as though they are thrilling. They are. This is a story that is told as a page turner. These are people who we want to know what happens to them. Obviously, that's partly to do with the fact that you are a very good writer, but I wonder how much of that was informed by your training as an anthropologist.
I think that anthropology helped me a lot as a journalist because it made me lean into the idea that you're always an outsider wherever you are, and you should always view yourself in a place almost as an immigrant or a Martian even, and therefore things that other folks take for granted, you should really focus on them and embrace them and ask them questions about them and capture it all. And I think that ethic falls away when you're a beat reporter because you become accustomed to norms within that topic or that place or those people. That's how you get good at your beat. But in my case, I wanted to approach every place as a foreign world. And I tried to really accentuate that in this book, partially because I really do believe that the very notion of getting on these ships and heading out to sea is a bit like space travel on Earth. You're getting in a spaceship and you're traveling to a place that most people don't go. You can't really get off the spaceship. And you're in this weirdly claustrophobic and agoraphobic world in that you're stuck on a ship with all these other people, but you're in this bizarrely sprawling, powerful place. And so with that in mind, I kind of always viewed the characters as otherworldly and therefore needing to be captured and rendered in that kind of Martian wide-eyed way.
In that context, I mean, it obviously takes guts to be away from what other people would regard as their conventional lives for as long as you have been in order to research this. But it takes guts, it takes courage, and I wonder how frightened you ever were. Can you give us examples of moments when you have been scared?
So I always balk a little bit at this question, and I think you as a fellow journalist will understand why, partially, especially someone who's done a lot of foreign reporting, because for any fear I felt, the reality was that the people I was talking to, not to mention the people I'd brought with me, so the in-country translators and fixers and co-reporters and photographers, or the sources that I was reporting on, were always facing far worse. They can't leave, they have to stay when I leave, and they'll deal with the repercussions of what I write. And so all that makes me a little queasy about ever talking about my own fears or sense of danger. That said, I think there were two types of dangers / fear. One was the conditions on these vessels. The reality quickly sunk in, months into this reporting, that if harm's going to come to you, it's probably going to be by way of sickness or infection, because these ships are extremely dirty places, and you're sleeping on the ground, and there are rats running over you, and you're not showering for days on end, and you're eating questionable stuff, and you can't get back to shore. And I saw people getting sick and saw the problem that creates. So I think that's a real risk. Not to mention, you're on a lot of these ships, especially the really poor, barely seaworthy ones. It's best to imagine it as sort of a developing world factory with none of the OSHA protections on the machinery, that runs nonstop. It's overcrowded. Its floor is skating rink slippery. It's moving up and down all the time like an elevator, several floors. And the people around you, those workers, many of whom are barefoot, are master acrobats. So they know how to not fall, and you don't. And you're also working on, 30, 40 hours of no sleep, and it's middle of the night, and no one's watching you. And so all these things are the real dangers of that reporting. There were some not nice people along the way that were not happy with us being there. And there were several of those instances in Somalia, in Borneo, where we, meaning my photographer, a guy named Fabio Nascimento, Brazilian, and I were in really thorny situations where, in the middle of interviews, in one case, armed men showed up and said, this is over, and it got very aggressive and heated. And then in Somalia, we got stuck and sort of lost our security and had no way out. And those are two moments that I was genuinely scared.
And in those moments, I mean, because it's quite clear that the stories that you're telling in this book are, that there is this point at which I'm just quoting from the book, that the ocean lends itself to bystander syndrome. Someone else will police the crimes. It's not a tragedy, but an opportunity. This idea that you are in this lawless zone anyway, that you've put yourself forward in order to report on this. I mean, I wonder to what extent how do you square that with a life that you clearly have not on the sea? I mean, what does your family think about you doing what you're doing?
You should ask them, because you'll get an honest answer. I'll give you my answer, which is much more measured than I think they might offer. I think my family has resigned themselves to the fact that I'm very stubborn and I'm going to do this. And the more that I do it, the more I feel like I have to keep doing it, because I think the more you see awful things, the more you're haunted by them when you get back. And the more you feel like the only thing you can do to counter that sense of guilt and complicity and awareness is to keep reporting and to do it better next time and to not give it up. So I think they've reckoned with that fact that I'm doubling down and going to keep at it. I think also I always say when I get back and I have no new holes in my chest, like that I've been careful thus far and I'll continue to be careful. So I think that builds up some trust, but I know it causes a lot of heartburn for those around me.
Sure. And I'm so struck by you saying that the people who are in these situations are putting themselves in much more danger. I want to focus just a little bit on something you mentioned before, the karaoke bars, because you say in the book yourself that of all the things that you've seen, what you saw there was the most sinister. Describe, paint a picture for us of what took place in those bars.
Yeah, I mean, so it's funny that a book all about offshore brutality has potentially its most haunting moment for me personally in an onshore context. But this was in a karaoke bar at around 3 a.m. in this crappy, border town where we were there wanting to look into this whole sex work entrapment scene. And we sat down, we being the photographer and I, and did not we didn't have to say what we were. We just postured as if we were just dumb Westerners looking for a good time. But we didn't have cameras out or pen and paper out or anything. And the bar owner, the brothel owner, came over, a young man, and began talking us up and asking us if we wanted to have fun. And in the far corner of the room were these 3 young women, is what I thought at the time, kind of sequin top and mini skirt and caked on makeup and all dolled up and clearly sex workers. And the brothel owner proceeded to tell us about them. And he then pulled out a stack of Polaroids, which showed, and he referred to these 3 women, girls, as it turns out, as very popular, his most popular. And he pulls out these Polaroids and shows us how much he had improved them in the 6 months since he brought them across the border. And the Polaroids are of these little girls, one of them holding a stuffed animal. And when I saw the picture of the girls and then looked over at these females in the corner and realized they were the same people, it was this chilling moment. And the brothel owner was attempting not just to sell their services to us, but to sell them to us, actually to own these people. And I felt, and to this day felt, so sullied and conflicted and disturbed by that interaction, to see it up close and to know that we were just in nowhere. This was just one little place that we happened to come upon. So this was clearly going on all over the place. And so I just think like that reality of human slavery, and that it involves people that are so young, and the sense of powerlessness I felt in, and just real, to be honest, uncertainty about the ethics of the journalistic duty of remove, and whether that's actually ethical to not do something other than just chronicle that moment. Those things will probably stay with me till I die.
I wondered also about the rapes that took place on the vessels, because that's clearly something that nobody is ever held accountable for, and it feels routine.
Right. There's a fleet. In one chapter, I had the ambition of using a ship as a character, as the main character, not a person. And I thought that would be a really good way to show just how bad some of these villains can be. And instead, I ended up focusing on a fleet of really bad of ships. And those ships, called the Ouyang fleet, had a severe problem with rape on board. And that, I think, as you point out, is especially dark because you're essentially stuck in a prison cell with your abuser for an indefinite period of time. They don't speak your language, and there's a hierarchy that says you have to do what they say. And that just seemed, as you say, it's just another ring of Hades.
I wonder about, you talk about the discomfort of being a reporter and seeing the terrible things that you're seeing. I wonder also about the reader's complicity in what you are reporting, because a lot of what is happening illegally at sea connects to what we take completely for granted on land. So, for example, 1 in 5 fish that's served on a dinner plate around the world has been caught illegally. What direct result has there been from what you have reported? Has there been a shift or a change in any of the laws, or at least the way in which the laws have been implemented?
So I think in the past 5 years, there has been a big shift. And I don't think it's by any means exclusive to my reporting. The Associated Press, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and the U.S. State Department, the EU, a lot of key players have been on this very effectively, and I was a part of that movement. I think the movement has triggered a reckoning that is in some ways akin to what historically we saw with, say, sweatshop-free garments or blood diamonds or dolphin-free tuna. These are all moments in history when a specific type of product had a sort of awakening about abuses, human rights, labor, environmental, whatever, in their supply chain, and they couldn't turn away from it. And from company to consumer to government, complicity was all laid to bear. And I think seafood, international seafood, is having to some degree that reckoning. I think that there is a lot going on at the EU and in the US, especially with the last administration, that's trying to figure out how to counter this. I think there's also a reckoning that's interesting within the advocacy community, because the environmental movement that seeks to protect the oceans has long ignored crimes above the waterline to the people out there, because that's the realm of labor unions and human rights workers. And I think that's a big problem, and one of the reasons why things have been allowed to get as bad as they are. And I think now those types of groups are talking to each other a bit more.
I don't really want to leave the listeners with just the incredibly deeply grim picture that you paint, because there is, of course, this notion that we have, people who live on the land, who have a relationship with the sea, which we have constructed, and we tell ourselves that it's beautiful, we go there to escape and so on. But you also make it quite clear by the end of your book that this is a place that is of unparalleled beauty. I wonder if you would just reflect for us a little bit on that dimension of it in terms of what you observed.
So I think there's beauty in the place and the people and the activities. I think the place is this force more than a location. And to be out there, the experience of putting yourself in that space and traveling across it is on a human level, a really existentially humbling thing, because it's just the laws of physics, the laws of time, even psychology, your own biometric habits, all start changing out there. And I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think it's a marvel to witness. The creatures that are out there are just amazing. And also the more you study and the more you realize how important that space is for the organ that is the biosphere, that is the planet. So all those things are awe-inspiring. And then the people that are out there too are really inspiring. I talk so much about the villains, and there are so many heroes out there. And then there are also just a lot of average folk who are traversing it, working out there, and none of this stuff is happening to, but they show a really interesting difference to us landlubbers, which is sort of inspiring in its own sense. They've chosen a very different type of lifestyle, and there's amazing camaraderie on these vessels and resilience, even in these horrible conditions. So all of that sort of is very inspiring, and it speaks to just the beauty of the place.
Ian Urbina, thank you so much. You've given us, I think, a real insight, but also presented us in this book, The Outlaw Ocean Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier, with what I think is a masterclass in long-form journalism. So thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
This is Acast Recommends. Every week we pick one of our favorite shows, and this is one we think you're going to love.
Dear Joan and Jerica, my son often cries if he falls over or when he tries new things and fails. And my husband calls him a useless pussy, which makes him cry more. Is there something wrong with him? He's 3. Alison Longstead from Berkshire.
Yes, oh dear. Sounds like there's been some sort of rather mollycoddling mum. Too much.
Listen to the new series of Dear Joan and Jerica via Apple Podcasts, the Acast app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I mean, it really doesn't matter to me.
Acast is home to the biggest podcasts from the U.S. and around the world. Subscribe to this show and hundreds more now via Acast or wherever you get your podcasts.